Hello and welcome back to another Gloo tutorial. In this video we're going to explore Interactor with an in-depth overview of the Interactor Engine, GTM DataLayer Connectors, Zapier Connector and the Custom Webhook Connector. Now let's get into it. So the first thing that we need to do is enable the Interactor Extensions. So if we jump into the plugin settings, we need to make sure the Interactor Engine is enabled, GTM DataLayer Connector, Zapier Connector, Custom Webhook Connector, and we're also going to be working with the Dynamic Tag Everywhere extension. So now these are all set, let's jump into our template, let's go over each of these and how we can interact with our data dynamically. Let's get started. So before we take a look at DataLayer, Zapier webhooks and custom webhooks, let's just familiarise ourselves with Interactor. Now with Interactor enabled, the way that you access all of these properties and settings are in your template in the sidebar. You'll notice that we've got this new icon, which if you click on will take you to the Advanced tab, and this is where you'll find all of the setup. Now it's broken up into a few parts. If you enable conditions, you'll get this conditions option here. We've got triggers and events, and of course variables. So let's just familiarise ourselves with these options first and foremost. So with conditions enabled, what this will allow us to do is essentially create a condition. So we could do a firing condition type. So we can either use the trigger only if condition is met, or don't use the trigger if condition met. And what that essentially means is with the specific condition, which there are tons of different options, we can specify when we want this to fire or not. So let's just quickly take a look at a use case. So if we take a look at our template, just say for example you wanted only logged in users to be able to click on this check availability button and then fire off the rest of these actions, we can set that here, and the way that you do that is set the condition by choosing user logged in, and then you can assign it to a particular trigger which we'll get into in a moment, and then the trigger itself would be the button, and then of course that has its own specific actions. And then of course the events, the fires, the data layer, Zapier Web Hook and Custom Web Hook if needed. So as you can see, this is really handy in certain circumstances. We'll go back over that in a moment, but let's take a look now at the triggers, which is the trigger button. And there's a few properties in here. So you need to obviously give this some sort of title or a name. The firing event, which you have various options as you'd expect, from click through to key presses, submissions, through to input changes and any Ajax calls. So there's plenty of options in there depending on your specific need. The target is the element that you want to target. So again, if the ID of this button was trigger_btn button, that would be where we want to bind this trigger to. And then as we move down, we have the event to fire, the data layer, Zapier Web Hook, and the custom web hook. Now, of course, if you wanted to fire a specific event, for example, if we were to click on this button and then fire a prompt, display a message to say, thank you for your submission, we'll get back in touch with you shortly, or something along those lines. But let's just take a look at events so that we can show you what this looks like. So if we go into events, again, you need to give this a name so it's easily recognizable. There are certain event options. So we've got animations, interactions, emulations, and custom function. And of course, each one that you select, so if we go to animations, of course, this changes the next set of available options. So if you wanted to fire an event that would hide an element, show, toggle, fade in, fade out, etc., you just simply set it here. And of course you've got interactions, which are like alert, set value, add class, remove class. So they're all the jQuery functions that you'd expect if you was writing this with code. But of course we can just simply do this by building out these options in the Elementor way. And then we have a fetch form field. When toggled on, there's various different options in here. And then we have a parameter. So our event is an interaction of an alert. So the parameter is the message that would be displayed within that alert. And of course, with these fields, with dynamic tags everywhere enabled, we can actually fetch dynamic information if we wanted to. So if we clicked on this, Of course, you can access all of this information if needed. Then of course you can assign this to a specific view, so we can have mobile, tablet or desktop. And to create some sort of hierarchy or firing sequence, there's an option to enable fire next. So if we toggle this on, we could then create a chain of events. So if we had more than one event, we could then do this event, then another event, and then another event after that if we wanted to do so. So let's take a look at variables. So variables allow us to store information within a variable, much like you would do within coding. So you store that information within a variable that you can call back and use whenever you need it. So there's a couple of examples here. I've created post title, post content, and today's date. So I've just simply named them something very obvious. And the information I'm actually fetching is dynamic data. So the value is the actual post title. So if I was to remove this and then reset this, I click on dynamic tags, simply set the post title. So now that's stored in a variable called post title. And then the same thing is for post content. And then of course with today's date is the current date. So as you can see, that's how it all stores. We can then use this information to then pass through and use with the data layer, Zapier Web Hook or Custom Webhook. So when an event is fired, we can then use this information in these variables to send off to wherever we need it to go to. So let's take a look at those now. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with custom webhooks, but just to give you a very brief overview, what this allows us to do is create our very own custom webhook, but of course in the Elementor way, because currently within Elementor there is no way to do this. So we have now given you the ability to do so. So what we need to do is simply create a webhook name, so something that's easily recognizable. The webhook URL is from the third-party service that you're trying to interact with, and then you place the webhook URL within this field. Or if you have this stored as some dynamic information, perhaps on an options page within your WP admin area, you can simply fetch this information through the dynamic tag mechanism. Next option is method. So of course, with any sort of webhook, there's post, get, put, delete, and patch. So you just need to ensure that you select the correct method based on what you're trying to achieve with this custom webhook. And then finally, you have variables. So as you can see, variables are the ones that we've assigned above. So you can select any of your variables that you need to if they're to be involved in this custom webhook interaction. So as you can see, the custom webhook functionality is very, very straightforward, easy to set up, and incredibly intuitive. So now let's jump over and take a look at the data layer. So as we turn our attention to the data layer, you may or may not already know, the data layer is an object used by Google Tag Manager to pass information to tags. Events or variables can be passed via the data layer, and triggers can be set up based on the values of variables. So that's what we're going to do in this example using the data layer interact that we have created. So if we take a look at this now, so we need to provide a title and a variable. Of course, the data layer object, which is set to data layer by default. But of course, as mentioned, it's for advanced users, and you leave this empty to use a default data layer object. But of course, if you know what you're doing, you can just adjust this accordingly. So what we're going to do is create our first data layer, and we're going to call this data layer test. And then we're going to assign a variable to this. And what we're going to do is assign our post title just for this demo, and then we're going to see how this outputs when we create the trigger. So the trigger is going to be when the page is ready to fire off this data layer. So let's go ahead and take a look at this now. So if we go back up to triggers, what we need to do, the firing event is going to be ready, so on page ready. The title is going to be data layer test trigger, and the data layer that we want to fire is going to be our test data layer. So if we go ahead and update this, so if we take a look at the front end and inspect, what we need to do is find .push and you'll notice that we've got this new snippet of code, which is the datalayer.push, and as you can see, our post title is being picked up as Dream Holiday Home. So it's actually picking up this information based on the variable data that we've set. So as you can see, this is incredibly easy to set up, and typically this is something that would take such a long time to set up, but now the way that we've created this is incredibly easy to do yourself. So just to quickly recap on our data layer, of course this is bound to data layer to fire of the data layer test. Within the data layer itself, you're not bound to a single variable. So if you've got multiple variables set, now if you want to capture that data with a Google tag, you can create separate variables and then just capture them by adding more of your variables in here. So if we update this now, and again if we take a look on the front end, if we inspect the code, take a look at the data layer again, as you can see it's capturing post title, Dream Holiday Home, the post content, which is the content here, and of course today's date, and it's set in this particular format. So as you can see, you're not limited to one specific variable, you can capture as much data as you want or need. So the final interactor that we need to take a look at is the Zapier Web Hook. Let's dive into this and take a look at how this all works. So if you're not sure what Zapier is a platform that helps you automate workflows by connecting your apps and services you use together without having to code. So this is where our interactor comes in, because in the previous examples you can see that we can store data into variables, and what we can do with these variables with the Zapier Web Hook is push this information to Zapier, and then we can fetch that on the other end with another application, service or platform. So for instance, if we wanted to click on this check availability button, what this could do is could fire off a request to Zapier with all the information that we wish to collect from this specific page or from anywhere within WordPress. We can then capture that information and then we can do something with that data. For example, if we wanted to send some information across to Zapier, push that information out to the vendor's Slack channel, or send an email to the person that's possibly letting this holiday home out with an inquiry so that they can get back in contact with the person that is actually trying to check for the availability on this particular property. Now this is just a simple use case example. Obviously this would be different for the situation that you're working in. But the idea is, what I want to do is show you how we can capture this information here. So if we take a look at the Zapier Web Hook options, we've got the webhook name. So again, call it something that you can easily recognize. So if you need to go back to that in the future. The webhook URL is actually provided by Zapier itself, which we'll show you in a moment. And of course, the method is either post or get. Because in our situation, what we want to do is click on this button and post this information to Zapier and then send that off to fire off an email or alert Slack, for instance. We're going to post this information out. Then the data that we want to capture and send out is the post title, post content, and today's date. So the next thing that we need to do is jump over to Zapier, take a look at how this works, how this data is received, and then what we can do with it. Let's jump over there now. Okay, so now that we're in Zapier, the first thing that we need to do is create the Zap itself. So the first thing that we're going to do is name the Zap, and we're going to call ours check availability. And what we're going to use as our trigger is a webhook. Now what we're going to do is capture the information that's stored within the variables that we set up within Interactor on our website. So what we're going to do is click on webhook. The trigger event that we need to use in our instance is catch hook. If you remember, we're using the post method. And if we click on continue, and then what we need to do here is ensure that we use the custom webhook URL that's provided. So if we copy this, we head back to our application, and if we go back down to the Zapier webhook itself, and we ensure that the field is set correctly here, so the webhook URL, we're still going to post all of this information here and keep the name of the webhook name as data collection. Let's click on update. Let's go back to Zapier. If we click on continue. So what we need to do now is, now that we've set the URL, we need to go back to our application front end. We need to refresh. Let's click on the check availability button, because when we click on this is what's going to send the information over to Zapier. The alert is fired, so your request has been sent. We will be in touch shortly. And then amongst that would have sent the data over to Zapier. So let's click OK. Let's go back to Zapier. Continue. Now let's test our trigger. As you can see, our test trigger, we've found a request, and the request A, because that's the first request that we created, is a query string of our post title, our post content, and today's date. So they're the variables that we set, and this is the information that we stored within those variables. So we're assured now that the information that we're sending from the website is now being captured from Zapier. So let's move on and click on continue. Now this is the action part. Where do we want to send this information to? So, as mentioned, there's loads of different options here, loads of different applications and services that you can send to. The example that we're working with here, I mentioned that we could send this off via an email or to something like Slack. So if you've got a Slack channel where you want to be alerted to if an inquiry comes in, simply set up Slack, we choose the event, and then we can send it to a channel message, a direct message. The options are pretty much endless, but obviously this is all geared around towards the way that you want to receive this information. So that's just one example. And of course, you can change the application to something like Gmail. So say if we wanted to send all of this information from the catch hook via send email on Gmail, let's click on send email. If we click on continue, it'll ask us just to assign an account. So if we just use this example account for the moment and click on continue, you can see that we can actually use the information that's being pulled in from the query string. So if you had a form or some sort of mechanism where the data was sent in an email address, you could actually send it to that specific email address if it's like a variable capturing that information. So the beauty about the actions when sending an email in Gmail is you can use the catch hook information, and again you can do that with all of these applications. But any information that you're specifically trying to send, you can either enter the text or insert data. So of course you can enter a manual to address, or if you manage to capture an email address, you could send that information to that specific email address that was sent via the variable. So if we take a look at a few more of these fields, you've got the from name, reply to, the subject for instance could be the post title, and then you've got the body text. So you could mix this up, so you could put some plain text in and of course insert the data from your hook. So you could really mix it up if you wanted to. So you could build out an automated workflow by capturing this information from your WordPress website using Interactor and sending it to Zapier, and then sending it on to the service or application that you need. So as you can see, this is really, really robust and dynamic. Interactor just makes it incredibly easy to capture this information because you already know how to work with Elementor. There's no code required and everything can just be set up within Elementor itself. So as you can see, Interactor makes it incredibly easy to capture any information that you want from within your website or template from anywhere within WordPress. You can use static or dynamic information in combination with using dynamic tag everywhere. It's pretty much limitless, and this just takes your web application to an entirely new level. I really hope you like this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.